The sun was setting over the hills of London, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. At the very top of the hill stood a huge mansion, shining with golden light from its tall windows. It belonged to Edward Langford, a rich and powerful man who was known by everyone in town. People said he had everything: money, cars, servants, and the biggest house anyone had ever seen. But those who worked for him knew the truth. Inside those fancy walls, warmth and kindness were hard to find. Edward was a proud man who believed that wealth gave him power over others. He liked to be admired and feared, not loved. Every evening his mansion came alive with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and classical music as he hosted grand dinner parties for other rich families. The guests would arrive in their finest clothes, silk dresses, black tuxedos, and polished shoes, all eager to impress him. Among the many servants running through the grand halls was Clara James, the new nanny. She had been hired to take care of Edward's two young children, Amelia and Charles, after their mother had passed away the year before. Clara was a kind and patient woman in her early 30s. She spoke softly, moved gracefully, and always wore a calm smile no matter how busy or tired she was. Unlike the other servants, Clara was not born into service. She came from a small town far away, where life was simple and people looked after each other. She had grown up in a modest home filled with warmth and music. Her father was a preacher who taught her to sing hymns at church, and her mother had once taught her how to play the piano. Those days were gone now, but the memories lived quietly in her heart. When Clara first arrived at the mansion, she was amazed by its beauty. The golden chandeliers sparkled like stars. The marble floors were so shiny that they reflected her face, and the long hallways seemed endless. But after a few days, she realized that beauty did not mean happiness. The house was cold, not because of the temperature, but because of how people treated one another. The other servants kept their heads down and avoided speaking unless spoken to. They knew that one mistake could cost them their job. Edward's sharp eyes missed nothing, and his temper was quick. He rarely said thank you, and often criticized even the smallest flaws: a wrinkle in a tablecloth, a delay in serving dinner, a spot of dust on the piano. Everyone walked on eggshells around him. Clara, however, carried herself differently. She worked hard, but with quiet confidence. The children adored her. Amelia loved listening to her bedtime stories, and Charles often followed her around the garden asking endless questions. For the first time in months, laughter began to return to their small corner of the mansion. Even the other maids whispered about how gentle and kind she was. Still, Clara could feel the stares of disapproval from the guests. Many of them looked at her as if she did not belong there. It wasn't just because she was a servant. It was because she was a black woman in a world where most people in power were white and wealthy. Whenever she entered the room, conversations would pause. Some would whisper, some would smirk, and others would pretend not to notice her at all. But Clara held her head high. She knew who she was, and she refused to let their cruelty break her spirit. One afternoon, as she cleaned the main hall, Clara paused by the grand piano. It was an exquisite instrument, black, shiny, and elegant, sitting proudly in the corner of the room like a jewel. She couldn't resist touching the smooth keys for a moment. Her fingers pressed down lightly, and a soft note echoed through the empty hall. For a second, her heart fluttered. Memories came rushing back: her mother's voice, the warmth of home, the joy of music. But the moment didn't last long. The butler appeared, clearing his throat sharply. "The master doesn't like anyone touching the piano," he said coldly. Clara quickly stepped back and apologized. From that day on, she avoided even looking at the piano, though her heart longed to play again. As the days passed, the mansion grew busier. Edward planned another of his famous parties, one that would bring together the most important people in the city. Servants rushed to prepare everything: polishing silverware, arranging flowers, and lighting candles in every room. Clara dressed the children in their finest clothes and made sure they were on their best behavior. That night, as music filled the air and laughter echoed from the ballroom, Clara quietly stood near the doorway, making sure Amelia and Charles didn't wander off. She listened to the piano being played by a hired musician and felt something stir inside her. A longing she couldn't explain. The melody touched her soul, reminding her of who she used to be before life became about survival and service. Across the room, Edward noticed her for the first time, not as a nanny, but as someone who didn't quite fit his picture of perfection. He didn't like how she stood so calmly, with quiet dignity, as if she didn't fear him. Something about her composure annoyed him, though he couldn't say why. To him, servants were meant to be invisible. But fate had other plans. That night in that glittering mansion on the hill, a simple act of mockery would soon turn into a lesson Edward Langford would never forget. And the quiet nanny he once dismissed would change his heart forever. The grand hall was glowing that evening. Every chandelier sparkled like 1,000 stars, and the golden mirrors on the walls reflected laughter, movement, and pride. It was one of Edward Langford's biggest parties of the year. The air smelled of perfume, wine, and polished silver. Servants hurried silently with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, careful not to make a sound. Clara stood quietly at the edge of the room, wearing her crisp blue uniform and white apron. Though she was only there to watch over the children, she couldn't help but notice the glamour of it all. The shimmering dresses, the tuxedos, the jewels that glittered like tiny fires. But what caught her most was the piano. The same one she had once touched when no one was watching. It stood tall near the corner, its black surface gleaming under the lights. Tonight it was being played by a young musician hired for the event. The melody floated through the air like a dream. Clara's heart beat a little faster. She had always loved the piano. Each note reminded her of something pure and beautiful, something far away from the arrogance and cruelty that sometimes filled this house. The guests chatted loudly, their laughter echoing against the marble walls. Edward Langford stood among them, holding a glass of wine, smiling proudly. He liked to be the center of attention, the man of wealth, the man of class. Everyone admired him, or at least pretended to. But Edward was not in the best mood that night. Earlier that day, one of his business deals had gone sour. He was irritated, restless, looking for some way to release his anger. And when his eyes fell on Clara, quietly standing near the children, something in him stirred, and something cruel and careless. "Clara!" he called out suddenly. The music stopped. The guests turned their heads. Clara froze for a moment, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Yes, sir?" she said softly, stepping forward. Edward smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't warm at all. "You seem rather interested in the piano," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. A few of the guests chuckled, sensing the mockery in his tone. Clara's hands tightened in front of her apron. I only enjoy listening, sir." "Oh, is that so?" Edward replied, his voice playful but sharp. "Well then, let's see just how much you enjoy it. Why don't you play something for us?" The room fell silent. Every guest's eyes turned toward Clara. Some of them exchanged amused looks. Others whispered under their breath. The musician sitting at the piano glanced up awkwardly, unsure what to do. Clara felt her heart race. Her throat went dry. "Sir, I don't think I should," she said softly. Edward took a sip of his wine, his smirk widening. "Why not? Are you shy? Or perhaps you don't know how to play at all?" A few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd. Clara's cheeks burned. She wanted to disappear. She had played piano long ago, yes, but this wasn't a church hall back home. This was a grand ballroom filled with judgmental eyes. Edward took a step closer, his voice turning colder. "Come now, Clara. We're all waiting." For a long moment no one spoke. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. Clara could feel her heart pounding in her chest, echoing in her ears. Every instinct told her to refuse, to walk away, to keep her dignity. But she saw the faces around her, saw the children watching from the stairs, their small eyes wide with worry. If she refused, Edward would mock her even more. So, with trembling hands, she nodded slightly. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Edward raised his glass in mock celebration. Splendid. Let's hear what our talented nanny can do." He gestured toward the piano. The crowd parted slightly, giving her space. Clara walked slowly toward the shining instrument. Each step felt heavy, like walking through deep water. Her heart hurt, not from fear, but from the humiliation of being turned into a spectacle. She sat down on the piano bench, her fingers hovering above the keys. For a few seconds she didn't move. The silence was unbearable. Edward leaned back against the fireplace, smirking. "Any day now," he said under his breath. Clara closed her eyes. She thought of her mother, the way her hands had guided hers on the piano long ago, the gentle warmth of her voice saying, "Music can speak when words fail." She took a deep breath. Her fingers touched the keys. A single soft note rang through the air. Then another. Then a third. Then a third. At first the sound was faint and unsure, but soon something inside her awakened. Her hands began to move faster, more gracefully. The melody flowed like a river, smooth and full of emotion. It wasn't a fancy or complicated piece. It was a song from her childhood, one she had played at church when she was just a girl. But it carried soul. It carried truth. The guests stopped whispering. The laughter died. The music filled every corner of the room, wrapping around the chandeliers, touching every cold heart in that hall. Clara's eyes glistened as she played, each note speaking what she couldn't say aloud, about pain, faith, and the strength to rise again. Edward's smirk faded. He stood still, staring at her hands as they danced across the piano. He had meant to humiliate her, but instead he found himself feeling small. He didn't understand how such beauty could come from someone he had thought of as beneath him. When the last note faded, there was silence. Then came applause, soft at first, then stronger. Even the most arrogant guests clapped, moved by what they had heard. Clara stood up slowly, her eyes lowered. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly and walked away. Edward said nothing. His face was pale. For the first time in a long while, he didn't have a single clever thing to say. The sound of applause faded slowly, but the silence that followed was louder than any clapping could ever be. The guests didn't quite know what to say. Some exchanged glances, others quietly sipped their drinks, pretending to be calm. But deep inside, everyone felt the same strange feeling. Something powerful had just happened in that grand ballroom. Edward Langford stood frozen by the fireplace, his glass of wine still in his hand. His confident smile had disappeared, replaced by something unfamiliar. Confusion, maybe even shame. He had wanted to humiliate Clara, to make her look foolish in front of everyone. Instead, she had done the impossible. She had moved the hearts of his entire audience. Clara, meanwhile, walked quietly toward the back hallway. Her steps were small but steady. Her heart was still racing, but she didn't let it show. She could feel everyone's eyes following her, some in admiration, others in disbelief. The room that once made her feel invisible now seemed too bright, too heavy. She didn't want their applause. She didn't play for them. She had played because she needed to, because it was the only way to hold on to her dignity in that moment. She stepped into the quiet corridor, where the lights were softer, and the music from the ballroom could barely be heard. Her hands were trembling slightly. She pressed them together and took a deep breath. A tear escaped her eye, not from sadness, but from the release of all the tension that had built inside her. "Miss Clara?" a soft voice whispered. She turned. It was Amelia, Edward's little daughter, standing in her nightgown. She must have slipped away from the nanny's room upstairs. "You played so beautifully," the girl said, her eyes wide with wonder. Clara smiled gently and knelt down beside her. "Thank you, sweetheart. You should be in bed, though." Amelia shook her head. "I didn't know you could play like that." Papa looked strange. Clara hesitated for a moment, brushing a lock of hair from Amelia's face. "Sometimes people don't understand things until they see them differently," she said softly. "Maybe your father was just surprised." The child nodded, though she didn't fully understand. "Can you teach me one day?" Clara's smile widened, but her eyes were still sad. "Of course, my dear. One day." As Amelia tiptoed back upstairs, Clara straightened up and looked around the hallway. She could hear faint murmurs from the ballroom, people still talking about her, about what just happened. She felt exposed, as if every whisper was a finger pointing at her. She wanted to disappear, to return to the quiet, simple life she once knew. But deep inside, she also felt something else. pride. For the first time since she had come to this mansion, she felt like she had truly been seen, not as a servant, not as a black woman doing chores, but as someone with a soul, a story, and a voice. Meanwhile, inside the ballroom, Edward Langford was still standing near the piano. The party had resumed, but the energy was different now. The laughter was softer, the conversations quieter. People kept glancing at him, waiting to see his reaction. One of the guests, a man named Mr. Turner, approached with a smirk. "Well, Edward, I must say it, your nanny has quite the talent." "Where on earth did you find her?" Edward forced a small laugh. "I suppose I was lucky," he muttered. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit the truth, that he had never bothered to see the people who worked for him as anything more than tools. Another guest added, "She played with such emotion." "Remarkable, really. I could almost feel it." Edward nodded absent-mindedly, his eyes fixed on the piano. The instrument suddenly looked different to him, not as a decoration but as a witness to his own foolishness. He felt something twist in his chest, a feeling he hadn't known in years. Was it guilt, regret? He didn't know, but it stayed with him long after the guests had left. When the last car drove down the hill and the house fell quiet again, Edward walked through the empty ballroom. The candles were nearly burnt out, their smoke curling into the air. He sat down at the same piano where Clara had played, his reflection faintly visible on its polished surface. He pressed one key. The sound was dull and lonely. Then another. But no matter how many notes he tried, none sounded the way they did when Clara played. Her music had come from somewhere deep, somewhere real, and he realized he didn't have that kind of depth inside him. For the first time, Edward Langford felt small in his own house, upstairs. Clara lay awake in her small servant's room. She could still feel the smooth keys under her fingers, still hear the melody echoing in her mind. She thought of her mother, her old home, and the church where she had first learned to play. For a moment she smiled, but then she remembered Edward's face and that cold, mocking look before she began to play. The memory made her chest tighten. She knew men like him rarely changed. People with power often forgot their humanity. And yet something about his silence afterward gave her a strange feeling, as if a door had quietly opened somewhere inside his heart. Downstairs, Edward sat alone in the ballroom until dawn. The last candle flickered out, leaving him in darkness. He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts heavy. He had seen many things in his life, wealth, success, admiration, but never anything that made him feel as humbled as that music. And though he would never admit it, something inside him had cracked. Something that had been frozen for a very long time. That night, both of them, the proud millionaire and the humble nanny, couldn't sleep. One carried guilt, the other quiet strength. Neither of them knew it yet, but the melody that had filled that mansion would soon change both of their lives forever. When Clara's fingers touched the keys again, the room changed. It was as if time itself slowed down. The golden chandeliers seemed to shimmer softer, and the murmurs of laughter vanished into silence. Every sound, every note, filled the air like a whisper from the soul. Clara wasn't just playing music. She was telling a story. Her hands moved gracefully, her eyes closed as if she had left the room entirely. She was no longer the nanny in the blue uniform. She was a musician, an artist, a woman pouring her heart out to the world. Her song carried warmth and pain together, like sunshine after a long storm. The guests, who just minutes ago were ready to laugh at her, now sat frozen in their chairs. Some forgot to breathe. Others blinked away tears they didn't expect to feel. There was something honest about her music, something so pure that it made even the most arrogant listener remember what it meant to be human. The melody rose softly, then deepened, flowing like a river finding its way through rocks and roots. Clara played as if every note carried a piece of her life, her mother's laughter, the church choirs of her childhood, the long nights of loneliness when she first came to London. She remembered the fields she once ran through barefoot, the smell of rain on the red earth, and the warmth of hands that once held hers while teaching her the keys. Each memory became sound. The people in the room could not understand all that, but they could feel it. And that was enough. Even Edward Langford, standing near the fireplace, could not look away. His usual expression of pride had melted into something uncertain. His lips parted slightly, his eyes softer than before. He didn't know how to explain the feeling building in his chest. It was like hearing a truth he had ignored his whole life. For years he had lived surrounded by beauty, gold, glass, music, but none of it had ever felt alive. Everything in his mansion was perfect but cold, expensive but empty. Yet this woman, this nanny he had mocked, had somehow filled his lifeless home with warmth in just a few minutes. He felt something sting in his throat. Guilt, maybe. Or awe. The song reached its highest point, a rush of emotion that made everyone's hearts tighten. Then slowly it softened, fading into a tender melody that sounded like forgiveness. The last few notes lingered in the air, floating, trembling, before they disappeared completely. No one moved. For a moment it was as if the entire mansion held its breath. Then grew silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from emptiness. It was the kind that comes after something sacred, the kind that feels too precious to break. And then, almost suddenly, came a single clap. Then another. Then the entire room burst into applause. But this time it wasn't the shallow clapping of polite society. It was real. It was loud, warm, and alive. Clara didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply stood, her head slightly lowered, her hands trembling from the emotion of what she had just released. She glanced toward Edward for a second, just a brief look. Their eyes met, and in that look something passed between them, a silent message. Hers said, "You thought I was nothing." His said, "I was wrong." Edward took a slow breath. He felt something break inside him, the wall he had built between himself and the people he thought were beneath him. The guests began whispering again, but this time it wasn't cruel. Words like extraordinary, unbelievable, and soulful floated through the air. One elderly lady dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Such feeling," she whispered. "Such honesty." Edward tried to speak, but no words came out. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice betrayed him. For the first time in his life he felt small and yet somehow freer. As Clara walked away from the piano, the light seemed to follow her. Her simple uniform looked more graceful than any gown in that ballroom. She didn't need jewels or applause. Her strength came from somewhere deeper. Edward's friend, Mr. Turner, leaned toward him and murmured, "You've got a rare gem under your roof, Edward." "I don't think I've ever seen anything like that." Edward didn't answer. His eyes followed Clara until she disappeared through the side door. A thought echoed in his mind, quiet but strong. What have I done? For years he had surrounded himself with people who praised him, who feared him, who laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. But this woman, this gentle, humble woman, had shown him more truth in 5 minutes of music than he had ever known. He set down his glass and stared at the piano again. The polished surface reflected his face, but it didn't look like the face of a winner or a master of wealth. It looked tired, empty, and deeply ashamed. As the night went on, guests left one by one, still talking about the nanny who played like an angel. Edward barely heard them. The echo of Clara's music still filled his ears. He wanted to escape it, but he couldn't. It stayed with him, soft but powerful, haunting and healing all at once. Long after midnight, when the last servant had gone to bed, Edward walked to the piano. He placed one hand on its smooth surface. It was still warm, as if her spirit lingered there. He pressed one key gently. A faint note rang out, then faded. It sounded empty without her. For the first time in his life, Edward Langford realized that money could buy everything, except the beauty of a soul. The night after Clara's performance felt endless for Edward Langford. The mansion was silent now, the music long gone, yet he could still hear it, faintly like an echo inside his mind. Every note replayed itself, gentle but piercing, like the memory of something he didn't know he had lost. He sat alone in the grand ballroom, surrounded by the remains of his party, half-empty glasses, wrinkled napkins, candle wax hardened on the table, but none of that mattered anymore. His world, which once seemed so polished and perfect, suddenly felt hollow. For the first time in his life, Edward was thinking, really thinking. He remembered the look on Clara's face while she played, calm, focused, full of emotion. There was no fear, no anger, just honesty. She hadn't played to impress anyone. She had played from her soul. And that, he realized, was what made it so powerful. Edward took a sip of wine, but it tasted bitter. He set the glass down. His reflection in it looked tired, not from the party, but from years of living without purpose. He had spent his life chasing wealth, approval, and control. He measured success in gold and applause, yet none of those things had ever truly satisfied him. They only built walls around him, walls that kept out the very thing he had just witnessed: truth. Clara's music had slipped past those walls like sunlight through a crack. It had reached a part of him he thought was dead, the part that used to dream, feel, and care. Edward leaned back in his chair and stared at the piano. It looked the same as always, and polished, expensive, elegant. But now it carried meaning. It wasn't just furniture anymore. It was the place where a miracle had happened. He pressed one key softly. A single note echoed through the empty room. It sounded lonely. He smiled sadly. "You made it sound alive," he whispered to himself, thinking of Clara. The next morning, the mansion woke slowly. The servants moved quietly, cleaning the aftermath of the grand event. No one spoke much, but everyone had heard what happened. The story of the nanny who silenced the ballroom was already spreading through the house like wildfire. Edward came down later than usual. He didn't wear his usual proud expression. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his steps slower. When he passed the maids, they lowered their eyes, expecting his usual sharp comments. But he said nothing. Not a word. He walked into the dining hall and found his two children already eating breakfast with Clara. She was helping little Charles cut his toast while Amelia practiced reading a book aloud. The sunlight through the windows made everything glow softly. It was a peaceful scene, one Edward had never taken time to notice before. When Clara saw him, she stood up quickly. "Good morning, sir," she said politely. Edward looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. The words "good morning" felt too small. He nodded slightly. "Morning," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. Then, after a pause, he added, "May I speak with you later?" Clara hesitated. "Of course, sir." After breakfast, she followed him into the study. The air between them was thick with unspoken feelings. Edward stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the garden. "Clara," he began, his voice lower and softer than she had ever heard it. "About last night." She stayed silent, waiting. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "What I did, asking you to play in front of everyone like that, it was cruel. I thought I was being clever, but I was being a fool." Clara blinked, surprised. She had not expected him to admit it. Edward turned toward her. His eyes were heavy with sincerity. "You taught me something last night," he said. "You showed me what real grace looks like. Not the kind that comes from wealth, but the kind that comes from strength." Clara looked down for a moment, her hands clasped gently in front of her apron. "I didn't mean to teach anyone anything, sir," she said softly. "I just played what I felt." "That's exactly what makes it powerful," Edward said. "You played the truth, and I—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I've spent my whole life running from it." For a long moment, the room was quiet except for the faint chirping of birds outside. Edward finally sighed. "You must think very little of me." Clara looked up then, meeting his eyes. "No, sir," she said gently. "I think you made a mistake, and like all of us do. But what matters is what you do after." Her words struck him deeper than she knew. He nodded slowly, humbled. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for last night, but for reminding me that there's more to life than this." He gestured around at the grand, empty room. Clara smiled softly. "Music has a way of reaching places words can't," she said. Edward nodded again. "It reached me," he admitted. He watched her leave the study, and for a long time afterward he stood by the window thinking. For years he had believed that power came from wealth and control. But now he saw it differently. True power, he realized, came from compassion, from the ability to touch hearts, not just command respect. That night, Edward canceled another party he had planned. Instead, he spent time with Amelia and Charles, listening to them laugh as Clara read them stories. For the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel cold. It felt like a home. And though Edward knew he could never undo the way he had treated her before, he silently promised himself one thing. He would never again let pride blind him to the worth of another soul. As he watched Clara smiling with the children, the melody of her music returned to his mind. soft, forgiving, eternal. It wasn't just a song anymore. It was a turning point. The next morning dawned quietly over the Langford mansion. The air was fresh after a night of light rain and the garden sparkled with dew. Birds sang softly outside the tall windows, as if the world itself was ready for something new. Edward Langford woke earlier than usual. For years he had begun each day the same way, with a heavy mind and a strict routine. But today felt different. He couldn't stop thinking about Clara's words from the day before. What matters is what you do after. Those words had echoed in his head all night. He had turned them over and over again, realizing how true they were. Regret meant nothing unless it was followed by change. Edward walked down the long hallway to his study. The house was still quiet. Even the servants hadn't begun their morning chores yet. He paused by the grand piano in the ballroom. His fingers brushed the smooth black surface where Clara had played. He could almost feel her presence in the air, calm, steady, and kind. He sat on the piano bench and stared at the keys. He didn't press them this time. He simply sat in silence, thinking. For the first time in his life, Edward wanted to do something not to impress others, but to make things right. A little later, as the house woke up, Clara entered the ballroom to tidy up. She froze when she saw Edward sitting there. It was unusual for him to be awake so early, and even more unusual for him to be sitting quietly with no drink, no book, no demand. "Good morning, sir," she said softly, not wanting to disturb his thoughts. Edward turned toward her, his expression thoughtful but gentle. "Clara," he said, "I've been waiting for you." She hesitated. "Is something wrong, sir?" He shook his head. "No, Clara, something's right. Or at least I'm trying to make it so." She blinked, unsure what he meant. Edward stood up slowly and took a deep breath. "I owe you more than words can express," he said. "I already apologized yesterday, but I don't think I said everything I needed to say." Clara lowered her eyes modestly. "You don't have to, sir." "Yes," he said firmly, "I do." He walked toward her, his voice low but filled with emotion. "When I asked you to play that night, I wasn't just being cruel. I was showing everything wrong with the man I've become. Proud, arrogant, blind to others' worth. I thought money made me superior. But when you played—" He paused, searching for the right words. "When you played, you reminded me what real value looks like." Clara looked up then, meeting his eyes. They weren't cold anymore. There was sincerity, even vulnerability, in them. "Sir, I wasn't trying to prove anything," she said softly. "Music is the only way I know how to speak from the heart." "That's all I did," Edward smiled faintly. "And in doing that, you spoke to everyone in that room. You spoke to me louder than any words ever could." Clara felt her throat tighten. She wasn't used to seeing men like Edward apologize, not to someone like her. In her experience, the rich rarely looked back once they had humiliated the poor. But here he was, standing in front of her, not as a master speaking to a servant, but as a man speaking to another human being. Edward took a deep breath. "Clara, I want to ask for your forgiveness, not as your employer, but as a person who has wronged you. I can't erase that night, but I can promise it will never happen again." Clara's eyes softened. She could feel the honesty in his words. "There's nothing to forgive," she said gently. "You were unkind, yes, but I've seen kindness in your children. That means there's kindness in you too. Maybe it just needed reminding." Edward chuckled softly, lowering his gaze. "Perhaps you're right. They always say children reflect their parents. I suppose I owe them and you more than I ever realized." For a moment they stood in silence. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, falling across the piano like liquid gold. Dust particles floated in the light and everything felt still, peaceful. Edward looked at her again. "Would you play again, Clara? Not for me, not for the guests, just for the house." She hesitated, surprised. "Now?" He nodded. "Now. The house feels different when your music fills it." Clara smiled softly. She sat down and placed her fingers on the keys. This time there were no eyes watching, no cruel laughter, no pressure. Just her, the piano, and the soft light of morning. She began to play, a simple melody, tender and warm. The notes drifted through the empty halls, wrapping the mansion in calm. Edward closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. For the first time, he didn't feel like a master in his own home. He felt like a man rediscovering something precious he'd long forgotten: humility. When she finished, Edward opened his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the music, and for your grace," Clara smiled. "Thank you for listening, sir." "That's all I ever needed," he nodded, feeling something lift from his heart, the weight of pride perhaps, or years of loneliness disguised as power. As Clara left the room, Edward remained standing by the piano, still hearing her music echoing faintly. For the first time in decades, he felt at peace. Later that day, he told his children, "Miss Clara isn't just your nanny. She's part of this family." And when he said those words, even he couldn't believe how right they felt. Years passed after that unforgettable night in the Langford mansion. The memory of Clara's piano performance never faded, not for Edward, not for his children, and not even for the servants who had watched the moment in awe. It became a quiet legend inside the house. The night when music broke pride, when kindness softened arrogance, and when two very different souls learned to see each other as equals. Life inside the mansion slowly changed. The air that once felt heavy and strict began to fill with warmth and laughter. Edward was no longer the cold, commanding master who barked orders from behind a newspaper. He still carried his pride, yes, but it had been reshaped, softened by humility, strengthened by gratitude. He started spending more time with his children. Instead of late-night parties, there were evenings of reading, storytelling, and, most surprising of all, music. He had asked Clara to give Amelia and Charles piano lessons, saying, "If they learn from you, perhaps they'll learn more than just music." Clara agreed, though she was shy about it at first. But soon her lessons became the heart of the household. Every afternoon, laughter and melody filled the halls. The sound of the piano, once a symbol of luxury and pride, had become a symbol of togetherness. Sometimes Edward would stand quietly at the door, watching as Clara guided Amelia's small hands across the keys, or encouraged Charles to keep trying when he made mistakes. The patience in her voice, the way she smiled at every note, it humbled him again and again. He began to see that dignity had nothing to do with money or background. It lived in the way people treated others, in compassion, in forgiveness, and in grace. One day, as Clara was finishing a lesson, Edward approached her with a folded letter. "I've made arrangements," he said. Handing it to her, Clara opened it carefully and gasped. It was an acceptance letter, a sponsorship for her to teach music at a local school. He had used his influence to give her a position where her gift could reach more people. "I can't accept this, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "You've already done so much." Edward shook his head. "You've given my children more than I ever could. You gave me back my humanity. This is the least I can do." Tears filled Clara's eyes. She had never expected kindness from someone like him. For so long she had been judged for her skin, her class, her place in the world. But in that moment none of it mattered. What stood between them wasn't wealth or difference. It was respect. And respect, she realized, was the rarest gift of all. The day Clara left the mansion, the children clung to her hands. Amelia cried softly, and even little Charles tried to hide his tears. "Will you come back?" he asked. Clara knelt down, smiling through her own tears. "I'll visit," she promised, "and I'll always be near, in every note you play." Edward walked her to the door himself. As they stood at the grand entrance, the same place where she had once been just a servant arriving for work, he reached out his hand. "Clara," he said quietly, "thank you for everything." She took his hand firmly, her eyes shining. "Thank you, sir, for listening." And with that, she stepped out into the morning sunlight, her figure glowing in the golden light. Years later, Edward Langford was no longer the man society once feared or admired. He became known instead for his generosity and his efforts to support education and music for underprivileged children. Whenever someone asked what had changed him, he would simply smile and say, "A melody taught me what money never could." Amelia grew up to be a kind, thoughtful woman who became a pianist like Clara. She played not for fame, but for the joy of sharing music that touched hearts. Charles, too, carried that same warmth into his life, often telling friends, "We had a nanny once who could make even silence sound beautiful." And Clara, Miss Clara James, became one of the most beloved music teachers in the city. Her students adored her. She never scolded or bragged. Instead, she always told them, "Play with your heart, not your hands." Music isn't about perfection, it's about truth. Sometimes when she played alone in the quiet of her small music room, She would think back to that grand piano that night, that moment when the world had seemed against her, and how one act of courage had changed everything. The melody she had played that evening lived on in her memory, gentle, brave, and forgiving. It was no longer just a piece of music. It was a reminder of the night when she found her voice and made others listen, not through anger, but through grace. And somewhere in a large house on the hill, an older Edward Langford would sit by the window, listening to the faint sound of the piano that his daughter now played. The same melody, the same message. He would close his eyes and smile, whispering softly, "Thank you, Clara," because in the end, her music had done what nothing else could. It had turned a mansion into a home, a proud man into a humble soul, and a single melody into a legacy that would never fade, and a single melody into a legacy that would never fade.